Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into the world of one of the most enduring and fascinating figures from the ancient world, the Egyptian goddess Isis.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got a stack of sources here, articles and research that trace her history, her many incredible roles, and her journey across cultures and, well, millennia.
Our mission in this deep dive, drawn directly from these materials, is to understand how this goddess, starting out in ancient Egypt, transformed, expanded, and became known by countless names.
Right. A figure of immense power and devotion stretching all the way from the Nile down through the Roman Empire.
So we'll follow her story, her mysterious origins, the foundational myths that shaped her,
How her identity just kept shifting and growing over time.
the ways people worshipped her, and the big question, why did her influence last so long?
And honestly, based on digging into these sources, here's where it gets really interesting. How does one single deity manage to gather so many different aspects, so many names, and resonate with people for thousands of years?
Yeah, exactly. Let's jump in. So let's start right where your sources begin, with her name and her very earliest identity back in Egypt. What did the texts tell us?
Well, her Egyptian name was East, pronounced something like Iset.
Mm-hmm.
The Greeks knew her as Isis, which is, the name that stuck for us.
Right.
What's fascinating, and one of the first things the sources highlight, is that the hieroglyphic writing of her name actually includes the sign for a throne.
Right. I noticed that in the materials, the throne sign. Was there an idea originally that she was the throne, like a personification of royal power because of that?
That theory definitely popped up among some earlier scholars like Seeth and Frankfurt. They thought maybe the throne itself was seen as the king's mother and therefore divine.
Mm.
But your sources point out that later scholars tend to dispute this. The etymology, the actual linguistic link between her name and the word for throne, isn't as strong as once thought.
Ah.
And there's a lack of clear evidence that the throne itself was ever, worshipped as a god. So that throne sign might just be phonetic part of how her name was written rather than what she was.
Okay, so maybe not the throne itself, but she was absolutely foundational to the Egyptian pantheon, right? Part of that key group of gods.
Exactly. She was part of what's called the Heliopolitan Ennead. That's the main group of 9 key deities believed to have descended from the creator god in one major tradition.
Gotcha.
Born to Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess, she was sister to Osiris, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the elder, and crucially, she was the sister and wife of Osiris.
And that relationship is absolutely central to arguably the most famous and influential Egyptian myth cycle, the story of Osiris. Isis is just vital there.
She is the linchpin. Your sources trace this myth cycle back to the pyramid texts, some of the earliest religious writings we have. The story starts with Set killing Osiris,
Yeah.
and in many versions describe dismembering his body into pieces.
Which sounds horrific, but it sets up Isis and her sister Nephthys for this incredible, determined search.
Right. They, along with other deities like Anubis, search relentlessly for the scattered pieces, and then, using their divine power and magic, reassemble the body.
Wow.
The sources show this act as the mythic blueprint for Egyptian funerary practices, particularly mummification.
She's often portrayed as the ultimate grieving widow in this part of the story.
She embodies that role completely. Her profound love and grief for Osiris, combined with her immense magical ability, are what allow her to temporarily restore him.
Just temporarily.
Well, yeah. The funerary texts in your sources are full of her laments, expressing deep sorrow, intense longing for him, and even righteous anger at his death. Emotions the Egyptians believe were powerful enough to help bring the deceased back to life.
But he doesn't fully return to the living world, does he?
No, that's key. Isis breathes life and breath back into him just enough to conceive their son, Horus, through a magical union. But Osiris's realm becomes the underworld, the Duat. Isis's actions ensure his legacy and continuity through Horus, who will become his heir and perform the vital funerary rites.
It's a really powerful story of devotion, resurrection, and continuity in the face of death, all centered on Isis's actions. So that founding myth establishes her importance, but what your sources really show is that her roles in Egypt didn't stay fixed there. They just kept expanding, becoming more and more complex over time.
Exactly. As the centuries passed, she evolved into arguably the most multifaceted deity in Egyptian literature, absorbing characteristics and roles from numerous other goddesses.
Beyond the devoted wife and mourner, how did her connection to the afterlife develop?
Well, her role in the myth directly mirrored her role in beliefs about the afterlife. Just as she restored Osiris, she was believed to help deceased souls become whole again. Like the goddess Hathor, she was seen as a nurturing, protective mother figure for the dead, helping them on their journey. Later texts, especially from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, emphasized her active role in the divine conception, and even suggested women could join her divine retinue in the afterlife.
And her role as a mother goddess became incredibly central, not just to Horus, but to many other divine figures.
Yes. While early traditions might have linked Horus's motherhood more strongly to Hathor, Isis rapidly became the quintessential mother figure, embodying maternal love and protection.
Right.
The sources describe her protecting the infant Horus, hidden away in the papyrus marshes of the Nile Delta, shielding him from Set's wrath and everyday dangers like snakes and scorpions.
The story of Isis and the 7 scorpions is a great example of that protective yet powerful maternal side.
It's a fantastic story found in the sources. She's traveling, disguised, vulnerable, seeking help for Horus, protected only by these 7 scorpions. When a wealthy woman slams the door in her face, the scorpions plot revenge and sting the woman's innocent child. But despite the insult, Isis, with her innate compassion, heals the child.
Wow.
It shows her willingness to engage with and alleviate human suffering, which was a major reason for her broad appeal,
She also helped Horus in his struggle against Set using her cunning and magic. I saw a strange detail about her head in the sources related to that conflict.
Ah, yes. In some versions of the contendings of Horus and Set, there's a moment of conflict where Horus actually beheads Isis, bit dramatic, and she ends up with a cow's head as a replacement.
A cow's head?
Yeah. This is presented as an origin myth for the cow horn headdress she later famously wears, further linking her visually to Hathor.
Huh. And her motherhood really did extend widely.
It did. She was seen as the mother of the 4 sons of Horus, those protective deities often associated with the canopic jars. She was linked to the fertility god Min and the sacred Apis bull, sometimes called the Isis cow. She even played a midwife role in mythical accounts of royal births, like in the Westcar Papyrus.
So compassionate and maternal, but also incredibly powerful and wise.
Definitely. Her reputation for magical power was immense. It was essential for bringing Osiris back and healing Horus. The sources call her more clever than a million gods.
Oh, wow.
She constantly used cunning and even transformation to outwit Set.
Like that incredible story where she tricks Ra to get his secret name.
That's one of the most famous examples. It's a historiola, a mythical story used in magical spells. She creates a magical snake that bites the sun god Ra, causing him agony.
Ouch.
Yeah. She then refuses to heal him unless he reveals his deepest secret name, gaining ultimate power over him, which she then passes to Horus. This story really highlights her supreme magic and intelligence.
You can see why she was big in magical texts.
Absolutely. Her prominence in magical texts, from healing spells drawing on her myths to protective spells for pregnant women, lasted for centuries, well into the Christian era.
She also became deeply connected to Egyptian kingship and even the cosmos itself. How did that happen?
Well, given that Horus was equated with the living pharaoh and Osiris with his deceased predecessors, Isis naturally became the mythological mother and wife of the king.
Makes sense.
Her importance in royal ideology really grew, especially in the New Kingdom. Temple reliefs show the king nursing at her breast, symbolizing his divine legitimacy.
Wow.
She also became closely associated with the human queen, even adopting queenly regalia, like the vulture crown and uraeus.
And her protection expanded beyond just the family or the king to the entire nation.
Yes. Her role as protector of Osiris expanded to protecting Ra's solar bark against the demonic serpent Apep, and ultimately protecting Egypt itself. Texts, particularly from temples like Philae, describe her as a fierce protector of the nation, more effective than millions of soldiers supporting kings and emperors in defending the land.
And her connections to the sky, the star Sirius.
Sources connect her closely to Sapdet, the goddess personifying the star Sirius. The heliacal rising of Sirius appearing just before dawn marked the start of the Nile flood season.
Ah, the flood connection.
Exactly, linking Isis to the flood, which was sometimes seen as her tears for Osiris. By Ptolemaic times, her connections expanded. She was linked to rain, the Nile in the sky, the sun protecting Ra, and the moon.
The moon, too.
Yeah, perhaps through associations with Greek goddesses like Artemis or Egyptian ones like Bastet. She's called Lady of Heaven in some of the Philae hymns. Her dominion over the sky mirroring Osiris's rule over the underworld.
This really sounds like the stepping stones to her becoming what the sources call a universal goddess.
That transformation is incredible. In Ptolemaic times, her sphere of influence grew to encompass the entire cosmos. She was seen as having power over all nations, not just Egypt, and animating the natural world with rain and life.
So not just in Egypt anymore.
Not at all. Hymns from Philae declare her dominion over sky, earth, and the underworld, stating her power sustains humans, the dead, and the gods themselves. Greek hymns described her as the beautiful essence of all the gods.
So it wasn't just that she was like other goddesses, but that other goddesses were sometimes seen as different aspects of her.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is the concept of summonism, seeing other deities as manifestations of a single supreme deity. It was applied to major gods in various eras, but it became a really prominent idea for Isis, especially in Roman Egypt.
Right.
Texts explicitly claim she was one goddess for the entire civilized world, embodying the characteristics of many different local deities.
I even saw in the sources that she's sometimes described with a creation role.
Yes, that's quite remarkable. At Philae, she's described as a creator figure, similar to the ancient god Ka, forming the cosmos through what her heart conceived and her hands created.
Wow.
While local cults might emphasize one particular aspect of her, the broader hymns often treated goddesses from across the Mediterranean world as merely different forms that Isis took.
With all these roles, her iconography, how she was depicted in art, must have been incredibly varied.
It truly was. In typical Egyptian art, she's often shown in a sheath dress holding a papyrus staff and an ankh symbol. Her original and most distinctive headdress was the throne sign from her name. She's often shown with nephthys, either mourning or protecting sarcophagi, frequently depicted as kites or winged women, maybe referencing the sound of wailing or their search for Osiris.
Did she take other animal forms in her depictions?
Yes, the sources mention she could appear as a sow, particularly representing her maternal aspect, or as a cow linked to the Apis bull. The scorpion form from her myth appears, and she could even be depicted as a tree offering nourishment to the dead.
And then, as her cult spread and integrated, she started adopting attributes from other goddesses.
Absolutely. With her close links to Hathor, she started being shown wearing Hathor's symbols. The sistrum rattle and the cow horns enclosing a sun disk.
Right, the cow horns.
Yeah. Sometimes she'd even combine those with her original throne glyph. And from the New Kingdom on, she adopted the regalia of a human queen, the vulture crown and the cobra uraeus on her forehead.
When her cult moved outside Egypt, how did her image change in the Greco-Roman world?
The sources show her statues and images there often adopted a Greek sculptural style, blending Egyptian and Greek elements. You see depictions like Isis Thermuthis, a snake-bodied goddess, or Isis Aphrodite figurines reflecting these syncretic connections. Her Hathoric horns might be smaller or reinterpreted as a crescent moon. She often wore elaborate headdresses combining Egyptian elements with leaves, flowers, or grain.
And that knot thing.
Yes, that very distinctive mantle tied in a knot over her chest. This knot became a widely recognized symbol of the goddess outside Egypt.
I've seen images of her holding things like a rudder or a cornucopia in Roman art.
Right, reflecting her expanded roles as Isis Fortuna or Isis Tyche, linked to destiny and luck. She'd hold a rudder representing control over fate and a cornucopia for abundance. As Isis Palladia or Isis Feria, goddess of the sea, her cloak would often be depicted billowing like a sail. And as Isis Lactans, she'd be shown nursing Harpocrates, the Greek form of Horus, an image that became particularly popular. Sometimes she's shown with her foot resting on a celestial sphere, symbolizing her cosmic control. The sources show this incredible diversity. Her imagery could truly represent anything to anyone, depending on the devotee's need or location.
So let's transition from how she looked to how she was actually worshipped in Egypt. How did her cult develop there over millennia?
Initially, the sources suggest she was more of a secondary figure within the royal ideology, but her importance really took off during the New Kingdom, especially through her connections with Hathor and the Queen.
Okay.
Then, in the early first millennium BCE, the triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus gained explosive popularity, becoming the dominant focus of Egyptian religion for many.
And kings started specifically associating themselves with her.
Yes. Nectanebo I, in the 4th century BCE, notably claimed her as his patron deity, explicitly linking her power to political authority. Even in the Kushite kingdom to the south, Isis was equated with the Kandake, their powerful queen mother.
The Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander, seemed to have really embraced her and promoted her cult.
They did. The Ptolemaic kings actively linked her to both Egyptian and Greek deities through what's called interpretatio Graeca, interpreting foreign gods through the lens of one's own pantheon.
Right, like seeing Greek gods and Egyptian ones.
Exactly. They saw resemblances between Isis and Greek goddesses like Demeter and Aphrodite. They also promoted the cult of Serapis, a new god blending Egyptian and Greek elements with a very Hellenized Isis as his consort.
And the queens? The Cleopatra.
Absolutely. The Ptolemaic queens, particularly figures like Cleopatra VII, closely identified with Isis, sometimes using titles like the New Isis.
Where were her main centers of worship in Egypt? Did she have her own temples, or was she usually in others' temples?
Sources indicate she did have independent priesthoods in early temples, like one mentioned at Abydos. But her earliest major temples were the Izayan at Babet el-Hagar in the Delta, and, most famously, Philae in southern Egypt.
Philae, that one comes up a lot.
It was huge. Philae became this absolutely massive pilgrimage site, drawing worshippers from all over the Mediterranean world. It was incredibly important for both Egyptians and Nubians who built their own temples there and continued worshiping Isis at Philae until the mid-5th century CE.
Wow, that late.
Yeah, making it the last fully functioning Egyptian temple for centuries.
What were the daily temple rituals like based on the sources?
The standard daily offering ritual was performed. The priests would dress the cult image, offer food. But the sources show variation in the Roman period. Some temples kept the Egyptian style with a secluded sanctuary.
Hiding the statue.
Mostly, yeah. While others adopted a Greco-Roman style where devotees could see the statue during the morning ritual, pray directly to it, and sing hymns. There was clearly a lot of cultural mixing happening among the worshippers.
Were there major festivals dedicated to her?
Yes, several prominent festivals appear in the sources. She was central to the annual Osiris rites during the month of Khoiak, where two women would act out the roles of Isis and Nephthys, lamenting Osiris in these dramatic performances.
Like a reenactment?
Kind of, yeah. There were festivals specifically for Isis, like the Amasisia, celebrated around her birthday, which involved carrying her statue through the fields to bless them for fertility. And at Philae, they had frequent festivals, sometimes every 10 days, involving processions to the nearby island of Bigya, considered Osiris's burial place.
And these Egyptian cults eventually died out, right?
They did. The sources point to a gradual decline due to lack of royal funding after Roman support waned and increasing hostility from the rising Christian population. Philae, as we mentioned, was the very last holdout.
Besides the official temple cults, how else was she worshipped by everyday people in Egypt?
Interestingly, your sources note that before the late New Kingdom, she wasn't commonly invoked in personal prayers or used in personal names. But from the late period onwards, her popularity exploded.
Ah, so it took a while.
Yeah. She became one of the most commonly named deities in personal devotion, often described as incredibly kind and ready to help. Hundreds of thousands of small amulets and statues showing Isis nursing Horus they're found everywhere.
Those little statues, right?
Yeah, exactly. She was also a frequent figure in household art in Roman Egypt, appearing in figurines and paintings in people's homes.
And those magical texts you mentioned earlier, drawing on her healing myths, that feels like a form of popular worship, too.
Absolutely. Her prominence in magical texts is significant. From the Middle Kingdom onwards, she's invoked constantly in healing spells, drawing on her success in healing Horus. Pregnant women would be magically equated with Isis for protection during childbirth. What's remarkable is that her name continued to be invoked in magical texts, even after temple worship ceased, sometimes appearing alongside Christian figures, possibly into the 6th or 7th century CE. It shows the deep hold her power had on people's imagination.
That's incredible endurance, and her power extended far beyond Egypt's borders, spreading dramatically into the Greco-Roman world.
That spread really took off in the late 1st millennium BCE, fueled by increased contact through things like Alexander the Great's conquests and the subsequent Hellenistic kingdoms.
Okay.
Greeks had been aware of Egyptian religion for a while, often viewing it as ancient and wise. An early Greek temple dedicated to her was actually built by Egyptians in Athens in the 4th century BCE.
And trade routes were key, weren't they?
Absolutely vital. The cults of Isis and Serapis spread throughout the Hellenistic world along trade routes. Places like the Greek island of Delos acted as major centers and springboards for her cult's expansion, including into Italy.
Delos, right.
Sources show her worship even briefly reached as far east as Iran. The form of the cult became heavily Hellenized, mixing Greek practices with those Egyptian elements, but it also played on its exotic Egyptian origins for appeal.
Rome, though, wasn't exactly welcoming with open arms at first.
Not at all. Her cult arrived in Italy around the 2nd century BCE and the Roman Republic authorities were deeply suspicious.
Why the suspicion?
The sources point to a key reason being the cult's independence from traditional Roman state religious control. Shrines were ordered destroyed in the 50s and 40s BCE, although she wasn't completely banned yet.
And the Roman conflict with Cleopatra VII, who closely identified with Isis, probably didn't help matters.
That definitely increased hostility. After Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, defeated Cleopatra, he banned Isis shrines within the sacred city boundary of Rome, the Pomerium.
Inside the main city limits.
Exactly, but he allowed them outside. This effectively marked her cult as foreign, but still acceptable, outside the city's core.
But over time, she was accepted.
Yes, remarkably so. Despite a temporary expulsion under Emperor Tiberius, her cults gradually became integrated into the Roman religious landscape. Later emperors, like the Flavians, even treated Isis and Serapis as patrons.
So she really made it into the mainstream.
Pretty much. By the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE, the sources show her cults were widespread across the Western Roman provinces. You find evidence of her worship in most towns, from Britain all the way to Spain, essentially on an equal footing with the native Roman deities.
So her roles and how people perceived her must have continued to evolve quite a bit in the Greco-Roman world.
They definitely elaborated on her existing roles. Her identity as wife and mother from the Osiris myth was expanded. She was sometimes credited with inventing marriage and parenthood itself.
Okay.
She became a major protector of women, helping in childbirth and even protecting virginity. Some texts called her the patroness of women in general, though the sources show some ambiguity in these texts, known as artologies.
The hymns listing her powers.
Right, those. Ambiguity regarding women's equality or subordination. She was frequently characterized as a moon goddess, complementing the solar Serapis, and a powerful cosmic goddess who organized the sun, moon, stars, time, and seasons, guaranteeing the fertility of the land.
It's so cosmic order.
Yeah, and they credited her with inventing agriculture, establishing laws, and other elements of civilization, drawing on similar traditions about Greek goddesses like Demeter.
And a really vital new role she took on outside Egypt was as a goddess of the sea.
This was hugely important for a vast trading empire like Rome. She became the overseer of seas and harbors, known as Isis Pelagia, Isis of the Sea, or Isis Feria, referencing the famous lighthouse at Alexandria.
Protecting the ships.
Exactly. This role emerged in Hellenistic times, blending Egyptian ideas about sacred boats with Greek traditions about sea deities. For Rome, she was essential for guaranteeing fertile harvests, because grain was transported by sea and protecting ships, ensuring the well-being of the empire's supply lines.
She even had military associations, right?
Yes, she acquired the title Isis Invicta, unconquered Isis, reflecting her role in protecting armies, much like she protected the king and nation in Ptolemaic Egypt.
So many roles.
Exactly. All these varied roles led to her being called Myrianamos, one with countless names, and Panthea, all goddess.
And that connects back to that idea of Samodeism we discussed earlier, seeing other goddesses as aspects of her.
Precisely. The apologies listed many goddesses as forms of her, portraying her as the supreme deity for the entire civilized world. While strict theological universality might have been limited by the gendered nature of Greek and Roman gods, these claims highlighted her unparalleled greatness and encompassing power.
And there's that famous idea of the veiled statue representing her.
Yes, classical writers like Plutarch and Proclus mentioned a veiled statue, which they sometimes conflated with Neith or Isis, presenting it as a symbol of her universality and hidden, enigmatic wisdom.
With that famous inscription.
Right. I am all that has been and is and will be, and no mortal has ever lifted my mantle. Very evocative.
One thing that made her cult stand out in the Greco-Roman world was the promise of help in the afterlife, which wasn't a huge focus for many traditional Roman gods.
That was a significant draw, according to the sources. Texts like Apuleius' The Golden Ass and various inscriptions suggest devotees believed Isis would guarantee them a better afterlife, although the specific descriptions varied, sometimes involving Osiris's waters or a journey to the Fortunate Isles.
And power over fate itself, that seems like a big claim for a deity in that context.
It is. Unlike the traditional Greek gods, who were themselves often subject to the fates, Isis was said to control destiny, relieve misfortunes, and even influence the moment of death.
So, real personal intervention.
Exactly. This claim connected her vast cosmic power with her personal compassion, offering devotees hope and agency in a world perceived as governed by predetermined fate.
Her iconography in the Greco-Roman world must have been a visual reflection of all these diverse roles.
Absolutely. It was predominantly Hellenistic in style, but incredibly varied in attributes. The Hathoric horn she wore in Egypt might be smaller or seen as a crescent moon, emphasizing her lunar connection.
Right.
She often wore elaborate headdresses, incorporating traditional elements with leaves, flowers, or grain. That distinctive mantle tied in a knot was a common feature. She carried Egyptian symbols like the uraeus or sistrum, or Greco-Roman ones like a scutula, a vessel for libations.
And the different versions.
As Isis Fortuna, she held the rudder and cornucopia. As Isis Feria, her cloak billowed. As Isis Lactans, she nursed Harpocrates. Sometimes, to show her cosmic domain, she's depicted with her foot on a celestial sphere.
So many images.
Your sources provide fantastic examples of this, from busts at places like Hadrian's Villa to small terracotta figurines found in Alexandria or frescoes in Pompeii. The sheer variety highlights how she could be visually adapted to signify her numerous functions and meanings.
Let's look at the worshippers in the Greco-Roman world. Who were these Isiacs?
Adherents were sometimes called Isiacs, though the term wasn't universally applied. The sources emphasize that joining Isis's cult didn't usually require exclusive worship. People could revere other gods, too.
So you could worship Isis and Jupiter.
Pretty much, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Commitment levels varied, and some priests even served multiple cults. But many devotees showed really strong personal devotion, some making Isis the absolute focus of their lives. The sources note that Isiacs were one of the few pagan groups in the Roman world with a specific name for their followers.
Did her cult attract people from specific social groups?
The sources suggest adherents came from all levels of society. However, ancient accounts sometimes imply she was particularly popular with lower social classes, which might have contributed to that initial suspicion from Roman authorities.
What about women? Were they particularly drawn to her cult?
Yes, women were notably well represented in Isis's cults, often in much higher numbers than in most other Greco-Roman mystery cults. Women could serve as priestesses, although perhaps less frequently in the very highest ranks, according to available inscriptions. Something scholars debate might just be due to the nature of the records.
And there were accusations about the cult.
Right. It's worth noting that some Roman writers accused the cult of encouraging promiscuity among women, which many scholars interpret as reflecting Roman male suspicion of women having a sphere of religious activity and autonomy outside the traditional household structure.
Interesting perspective. And the priests.
The priests themselves were quite distinctive, recognizable by their shaven heads and white linen clothes, based on Egyptian purity rituals. The temples had different ranks of priests and lay associations, but no evidence suggests a central hierarchy governing multiple temples across the empire.
And the temples in the Greco-Roman world, were they very Egyptian or more Roman?
They were largely Greco-Roman in architectural style, but consciously incorporated Egyptian elements. Your sources describe walled courts, Egyptian artwork like sphinxes, and often a secluded sanctuary mirroring Egyptian layouts.
The blend, then.
Definitely. They tended to have more elaborate layouts than typical Roman temples. Crucially, unlike in traditional Egyptian temples, the priests in the Greco-Roman world often allowed devotees to see the cult statue during the morning rituals and pray directly to it, and devotional hymns were sung.
Sacred water was mentioned as important too, right?
Yes. Water, symbolizing the Nile, was a sacred object. Hellenistic temples sometimes had underground cisterns, while Roman temples often featured a pitcher of water as a cult image, sometimes seen as a manifestation of Osiris.
And personal worship at home.
Isis and other Egyptian deities are frequently found in household shrines called Lauraria in Italy, alongside the traditional Roman protective household gods. This shows her integration into personal domestic piety.
What about ritual requirements, purity and initiation rites?
Ritual and moral purity were definitely emphasized, involving baths or periods of sexual abstinence. Devotees sometimes publicly displayed their piety through actions like singing praises or confessing past misdeeds.
And dreams.
Communication through dreams was believed to be a way Isis called people, sometimes summoning them for initiation.
And yes, mystery rites for initiation were performed in some temples, particularly in Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor. While these rites were presented as being of ancient Egyptian origin,
They weren't purely Egyptian.
not really. They were primarily based on the model of Greek mystery cults, like the famous Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter, but incorporated Egyptian symbols and themes. They offered a sense of intense emotional connection and a dramatic mystical experience, promises of direct contact with the divine. The Golden Ass, Apuleius's novel, gives that famous account of the Isis initiation.
It's the only detailed narrative account we have, though scholars debate its accuracy, but it's broadly consistent with other evidence. The protagonist describes a journey to the boundary of death, traveling through all the elements, seeing the sun flashing, and meeting the gods from close at hand.
Sounds intense.
It's a cryptic description, but it seems to represent a symbolic journey through the underworld, perhaps like Osiris's experience or Ra's nightly journey, where the initiate is brought back to a new spiritual life by Isis, mirroring how she restored her husband.
And the festivals in the Roman world?
Roman calendars listed major ones. The Novigium Isidis in March was particularly important. It celebrated her role as goddess of the sea, featuring an elaborate procession carrying a model ship to the sea or a river, and prayers for seafarers and the empire's safety.
The ship festival.
Exactly. The Isidia in late October-November mirrored the Egyptian Koyak rites, involving a ritual reenactment of the search for and finding of Osiris's body, followed by days of jubilation. There were also minor festivals like the Pelusia for Harpocrates' birth and the Lychnopsia celebrating Isis's own birth.
What's striking is how late some of these festivals continued, even as Christianity was rising.
It really is. Your sources mention that despite growing Christian dominance and sometimes persecution, these festivals continued throughout the 4th century CE. The Aja is recorded as being celebrated until at least 417 CE in Rome.
Wow.
And the Novigium Isidis may have lasted into the 6th century. Even when the specific religious meaning faded, some of the customs persisted, influencing practices that carried into the early Middle Ages.
That longevity leads us to a really fascinating and often contentious question: her possible influence on Christianity.
It's a heavily debated topic among scholars. Some, like Andreas L. Fuldi, have argued that certain Isiac customs might have been absorbed into Christian traditions, pointing to possible links between the Novigium Isidis procession and early forms of the medieval carnival festival.
And the broader idea that Christianity borrowed traits from pagan mystery cults, including Isis.
Yes, that's a major area of scholarly discussion. Points of similarity are often highlighted. Having devoted members committed to a single supreme deity, an initiation rite, the mystery rituals versus baptism, and a central theme of a dying and reviving divine figure.
Osiris versus Christ.
Right. However, as your sources note, many scholars today, like Hugh Bowden and Jamie Alvar, argue that these similarities aren't necessarily due to direct borrowing, but rather reflect ideas and practices common within the broader Greco-Roman cultural background of the time.
So common roots rather than direct copying.
That's often the argument, yeah.
The comparison between Isis and Mary, the mother of Jesus, is probably the most commonly discussed point of potential influence.
That comparison has certainly generated a lot of controversy, particularly in historical debates between Protestants and Catholics regarding the veneration of Mary. Some classicists, like R.E. Witt, argued that Isis was a great forerunner of Mary,
suggesting people just switch devotion.
Kind of, suggesting that former Isis worshippers might have easily transferred their devotion or understanding to Mary, noting shared areas of patronage like agriculture and sailors, and comparing titles like the Christian Mother of God or Queen of Heaven to Isis's titles like Mother of the God or Lady of Heaven.
But other scholars disagree.
Yes, exactly. As your sources indicate, historians like Stephen Benko argue that devotion to Mary was likely influenced by multiple goddess figures from the ancient world, not just Isis in isolation. And church historian John McGuckin suggests that while Mary's image or veneration might have absorbed some superficial traits or titles, particularly iconography.
The pictures.
Right, the visual stuff. But the core cult and theology surrounding Mary were distinctly Christian.
That iconography point brings us to the images of Isis nursing Horus, which are often compared to images of Mary nursing Jesus.
Yes, the images of Isis lactans, Isis nursing Harpocrates, are frequently cited as a possible iconographic influence on depictions of Mary nursing the infant Jesus, especially since nursing images of goddesses were relatively rare outside of Egypt. While the latest securely dated Isis nursing images are from the 4th century CE, and the earliest definite Mary nursing images are often dated to the 7th century CE, scholars debate the extent of the connection.
So there's a gap.
There is, yeah. Some argue the influence was limited to Egypt itself, where Christian artists might have adapted local visual traditions. Others suggest that late Isis images did influence Marian iconography more widely.
Like Bowman's idea.
Right. Elizabeth Bowman, for example, suggests that early Egyptian images of Mary nursing used that visual language, familiar from ancient Egyptian goddess iconography, to emphasize Jesus' divine nature. Ultimately, as Sabrina Higgins concludes in your sources, while iconographic similarities are plausible, it doesn't necessarily mean Christians deliberately adopted core elements of ISIS's cult.
So a really complex and debated area when it comes to Christianity, but her influence definitely didn't stop there. It echoes through later cultures in other ways.
Absolutely. Even after the extinction of her organized worship, the memory of ISIS persisted. Europeans, particularly during the Renaissance, often viewed Egypt as a source of ancient wisdom, and Isis was frequently linked to that idea, often symbolized by her veiled statue. Figures like Boccaccio and Annio da Viterbo portrayed her as a historical queen who brought civilization to Italy before the Greeks. Renaissance art, like in the Borgia apartments, reflected this interest.
And Western esotericism seems to have picked up on her quite strongly.
Yes, particularly the idea from ancient texts like Kori Kosmu or the alchemical Isis the prophetess to her son Horus of her passing secret mystical knowledge to Horus.
Secret knowledge.
Exactly. Early modern esoteric literature, often linked to the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, sometimes referenced her. Polius's description of her initiation in the Golden Ass had a significant impact, influencing descriptions and rituals in later secret societies.
Like the Masons.
Including elements found in Masonic rituals and works like Mozart's opera The Magic Flute, which was based on Jean Terrason's novel Cethos, featuring an Isis initiation.
That image of the veiled statue continued to be a powerful symbol.
It really did. Influenced by writers like Macrobius, who had equated Isis with nature, the veiled statue came to be interpreted as a personification of nature itself. In the 17th and 18th centuries, this resonated with ideas of nature as a nurturing mother, scientific truths waiting to be unveiled by human inquiry.
Science unveiling nature.
Right, or even a sublime, enigmatic cosmic power, sometimes linked to pantheism. During the French Revolution, which sought to de-Christianize France, Isis as the symbol of nature and science became a potent figure, appearing in revolutionary art and festivals.
Wow.
Linking the new order to a perceived, rational, pre-Christian past. Helena Blavatsky famously used the metaphor for her 1877 book Isis Unveiled, implying she was revealing hidden spiritual truths.
What about in modern Egypt itself?
In the early 20th century, during the Pharaonism movement of the 1920s and 30s, as Egypt sought independence and a national identity rooted in its ancient past, Isis became a powerful national symbol of revival.
A symbol for modern Egypt.
Exactly. Paintings and sculptures from that era, like Mahmoud Mokhtar's famous statue Egypt's Renaissance, played on the motif of her veil being removed, symbolizing the nation waking up or revealing its ancient glory.
And today, in popular culture,
her name and imagery pop up frequently. She appears in fiction, including in modern superhero franchises. Her name is used in advertisements. And personally, the ancient Greek name Isidoros, meaning gift of Isis, survived into Christianity and is the origin of the modern name Isidore.
Right, Isidore.
And the name Isis itself, tragically now associated with a different group, was actually a relatively popular feminine given name in recent decades.
She's also a significant figure in modern spiritual movements.
Yes, absolutely. In modern esotericism and neo-paganism, influenced partly by the expanded view of her in Apuleius and other ancient sources, she often represents the concept of a single great goddess embodying all feminine divine powers.
The great goddess idea.
Right. Groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and figures associated with neo-pagan witchcraft like Dion Fortune incorporated her into their systems. Reconstructionist Egyptian religions like Kemetic Orthodoxy or the Church of the Eternal Source revere her as a primary deity.
And the Fellowship of Isis?
Yes, that's an international organization dedicated to her, seeing her as a goddess who can truly be all goddesses to all people.
So, based on everything these sources lay out, what's the big picture here? We've traced Isis from her ancient Egyptian origins as a key figure in that foundational Osiris myth, through her absolutely remarkable evolution into a complex, multifaceted goddess.
A wife, mother, mourner, powerful magician, protector of kings and nations, queen, and ultimately, for some, a cosmic power embodying everything.
We've seen how she broke out of Egypt's borders, captivated the Greco-Roman world, inspiring deep devotion, mystery rites, and incredibly varied imagery, becoming for many that Panthea, the goddess of countless names.
Relevant to farmers, sailors, women, and seekers alike.
And her story didn't end with the decline of her formal cults. Her influence echoed through Renaissance art, fueled esoteric traditions, became a powerful symbol during revolutions, and continues to resonate in modern spirituality and even personal names.
From the banks of the Nile to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, From ancient texts carved in stone to modern spiritual paths, Isis truly lived up to that idea of being a goddess known by countless names, adapted and understood in seemingly endless ways across cultures and centuries.
And I think the really powerful takeaway from these sources, the question that lingers, is precisely that. How is it that one figure, created in a specific religious and cultural context thousands of years ago, could be so flexible, so adaptable, so endlessly reinterpreted, that she could mean so many different things to so many wildly different people across history? Something for you to ponder after diving deep into this.